Well, good evening, everyone. I've been really looking forward to preaching at the kind of renewed and revamped evening service, but I'm over at Pub Church where we've got baptisms, and we had to change the date of those baptisms to accommodate a family who wanted to come and actually physically be present. And actually, you can watch the live stream. Hopefully, if all the tech works, you'll be able to watch the live stream of those baptisms at about 7 o'clock this evening. But if you've got a Bible there, I wonder if you would open up Genesis chapter 32. That's where we are. And we're at this last story at the end of Genesis chapter 32. This story of Jacob wrestling with God. Most Bibles give it that title. Mine certainly does. It says Jacob wrestles with God. And I want to have a look at that story and what it teaches us. Because we actually live in a culture and a society at the moment where there's quite a lot of spiritual hunger, that people are quite genuine, I think, seeking and searching for a spiritual experience. They may not go to the right place for it, but they want a blessing from God. They want to experience something of the goodness that comes out of another realm. You might see that in people's spirituality around mysticism or tarot cards or crystals or even some of the more militant religions that are starting to emerge or form species of a religion that are kind of emerging all over the place. People are looking for a spiritual experience, that they're longing for it. And in a very real sense, what we have here is a deep spiritual experience. It is Jacob having a real encounter with God, with the living God, meeting him and experiencing him. And we know it's God that Jacob meets here for a whole number of reasons. First of all, the sheer power of the person he meets. In sentence 25, it says, when the man saw that he could not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. And actually, the Hebrew word here for touched his hip joint, is the word caressed. It's the gentle, loving touch. It's how a husband might wipe away the tear of a wife, or a mum might wipe away the tear of a child with the gentlest of touches. But this incredibly gentle and almost loving touch crushes Jacob's hip, one of the strongest bones in the human body. So there's this huge restrained power in the man that Jacob is wrestling. Presumably this man could have ended the fight at any point, and yet the fight goes on all night. This huge restrained power contained in a man. We know it's a man he's wrestling. It says it explicitly in sentence 24. A man wrestled with him. Exactly the same phrase in sentence 25. The man wrestled with him. So there's this divine power, this incredible strength that a caress can break a man's hip. An active, strong man in the prime of life in Jacob, and his hip is broken by a caress. And yet it's contained within a man. This is God in human form, which is Jesus, come down at this moment to wrestle in the dark with Jacob. In fact, the man himself recognizes that he is God. Sentence 28, then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have wrestled with God. You know, he recognizes himself at the end of the fight, at the end of the wrestling with God. He recognizes that he himself is God. This is who Jacob has met. And Jacob himself recognizes that. In sentence 30, I have seen God face to face. He's literally wrestled God. You can't get much more physically close to someone than wrestling with them. I often watch our 4 boys wrestling. You're meant to quieten kids down before bedtime, aren't you, before sleep? You know, give them a bath, read them a story. In our house, the ritual is a nightly wrestle just before they get into bed. We have a nightly wrestle. I often sit there watching, and you can't tell whose leg and whose arm is whose. They're just entangled in one another as they wrestle and roll around on the floor. Jacob has met with God in one of the most intimate, painful, revealing ways that is possible. This is a deep spiritual experience that I think we all long for in some way. So what I want to do is draw out 5 lessons for us, just quickly. 5 lessons that we can take from this Jacob-God experience of wrestling with God, of experiencing God, of being face to face with God, of being caressed by God. 5 lessons. Some will be correctives, some will be reminders, some will be encouragers. 5 lessons we're to take in terms of our own journey of experiencing God and meeting God and encountering Jesus fully and completely. So what are these 5 lessons? And I'll move reasonably quickly. The first is that Jacob is alone. It's an experience that is intensely personal, and it's not the echoes of another person's encounter. See, leading up to this moment, Jacob has separated himself from everyone and everything in his life. Earlier on in the chapter, we read about how he's taken all his servants, all his wealth, all his animals, and he's sent them on ahead of him. He's trying to appease his brother Esau after decades of hatred and war between them. So he sends all of his wealth, his status, his servants, his animals. He's sent them ahead, and he's left just with his family. And then we read, in sentences 22 and 23, that he arose that night and took his 2 wives, his female servants, his 11 children, and he left them and he crossed the Jabbok River. That actually he also leaves his family and he's intensely alone on the other side of a significant river. He's there on his own. In fact, sentence 24 really underlines that. It says, Jacob was left alone. Now, meeting with God and experiencing God is always more than just the personal. Our relationship with God is meant to cascade into our public life and into the public sphere. It's always more than personal, but it is never less than personal. That we cannot encounter God because it is the echoes of our parents or our family's experience. We cannot encounter God if it's simply the pass-me-down from society or inherited from a friend. We need to be like Jacob, alone, just us. No mediator, no in-betweener, no one else necessary. We're like Jacob, we're alone. It's just us. Secondly, this experience, this full, true and complete experience that Jacob has encountering God, encountering Jesus, is in weakness. In Jacob's weakness and actually in God's weakness as well. Look at sentence 24 and 25 again. It says, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he could not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. See, Jacob meets with God truly and fully and doesn't plead for blessing from God until he is weak, his hip totally broken. It's only once he's given up relying on his strength. It's only once he's stopped trying to think he can win this battle. It's only once he's stopped saying, I can battle to get this blessing. It's only once he's in weakness with a broken hip that he fully, truly is blessed by God and meets God. It's in our weakness that we meet God most fully and most completely. Not in our strength, not in our arrogance, not in our confidence, but where we are weak. But notice too as well, it's weak meeting weak. Because here God is weak. He's given up his divine form, whatever that might be, and come into his creation as a man. And then he restrains his power to the point that all he can do is break Jacob's hip when he could have crushed him, flicked him away like a pea. God in this moment is weak. And that's when we meet God. In our weakness and in his weakness. Ultimately, the weakness of God voluntarily on the cross in our place. That it's actually when Jesus is broken, when Jesus loses the battle as God in human form, that we truly fully meet him. When we come to him in our weakness, at his point of weakness on the cross. I'm reminded of the old communion words that appear in the Baptist liturgy, gathering for worship, where it says, come to this table not because you must, but because you may. Not because you are strong, but because you are weak. Come not because of any goodness of your own gives you a right to come, but come because you need mercy and you need help. So first, it's alone. It's always more than personal, but never less than personal. We meet God with no mediator between us and him. Secondly, it's in weakness, both our weakness and in God's weakness. We come to the cross with our sin, with our brokenness, and that's where we truly encounter Jesus. Thirdly, it's for blessing. This desire of Jacob's is that he might be blessed. God initiates it in sentence 24, that God comes to Jacob, but it's Jacob who pleads for the blessing. Sentence 26. I will not let you go unless you bless me. I will not let you go unless you bless me. He's desperately looking for real blessing, true blessing, satisfying blessing. Not the cheap imitations that Jacob's life has contained up until this point. He's gone through a number of marriages. He's had a number of affairs. He's got lots of wealth. He's got lots of status. He's got lots of reputation. But he's not found true satisfaction, true blessing in those things. He has to come to God in his weakness and plead with God for that blessing to receive that blessing. So do you come to God in your weakness, clinging on to God until God would bless you, wrestling with God until God will bless you? But then fourthly, a real encounter with God in human form changes us, transforms us. That's Jacob's experience here, isn't it? Let me pick it up in sentence 27. This is what it says. I'll read a slightly longer bit. He said to him, what is your name? And he replied, Jacob. Then he said, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have wrestled with God and with men and have prevailed. And then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, what is it? Why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed him. The blessing that he's given is a new name. Now, in the Bible, names are much more than simply the way that we identify people. They carry great weight and great meaning. They represent who you are or who you aspire to be. The name Jacob means conniver or trickster or shyster. It's someone who gets their way through the sleight of hand and tricks of the trade. And that has been Jacob's modus operandus up until this point. That he's got everything in his life through being a bit of a trickster, deceiving people, conjuring up situations that aren't true. And he comes to God in his weakness, in his brokenness, on his own, everything surrendered, pleads for blessing, and he's given a new name, the name Israel. The name Israel means the overcomer. And of course, it becomes the name of the nation, which Jacob here becomes the true father of. From this moment, the overcomer, the one who was the trickster, but is now the conqueror. Because of his wrestling with God, the whole nation of Israel is birthed from. He becomes no longer Jacob, but Israel. He is transformed and changed. Nothing is ever the same for him. And a true encounter with the living God changes us. Anything else that we claim is an encounter with God is false if there's not tangible change from that experience, a new name type change. And then lastly and fifthly, a true encounter with Jesus is to be remembered, to be remembered. We're told here as the story continues to unfold that forever Jacob, Israel as he is now, will limp. Sentence 31. As the sun rose upon him, he was limping because of his hip. Jacob would never forget this experience. He would walk with a limp, which reminds him of his experience with God. Many of us carry wounds from having met with God, maybe not physical, but wounds which remind us of that transformative power, that almighty experience of meeting with God. So it's to be remembered by Jacob, and ultimately by the nation Israel that came out of Jacob and came out of this moment. Because the last sentence here talks about the festival that the Jewish people still celebrate now, and how they don't eat a certain tendon from the hip socket because it represents this moment of Jacob's hip being broken as he wrestled with God. The whole nation across time remembers this encounter. So I want to urge you, if you're able to think back to an encounter, an experience with God, a moment you met him, a moment he spoke to you, a moment you experienced him, don't forget it. It's to be remembered. It's to encourage you to continue to seek that change and transformation that Jesus brings. It's to encourage you to remember that God has blessed you ultimately in Jesus in a way that is beyond what you've earned or merited. It's there to remind you that you need to continue to seek him alone, that it's always more than personal, but never less than a personal experience. And it's there to remind you that it's in your weakness and God's weakness where we meet the divine. It's as we come to his chosen point of weakness, his death on the cross, with our weakness, our sin and brokenness, that we truly meet and experience him. So there's 5 lessons from this remarkable encounter between Jacob and God that teach us what it is to experience and encounter Jesus, God who is man, in our own lives.